If you feel everything too deeply, Carl Jung had a warning for you before it is too late. He spent decades studying people exactly like you, and what he found wasn't a flaw. It was one of the rarest forms of human intelligence ever documented. But that intelligence has a cost, and if you don't understand it, it will destroy you before you ever get the chance to use it. So let's ask the real question here. Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation and just known, without a single shred of hard evidence, that the person in front of you was lying? Not suspected, not guessed, known. Like something deep inside you was reading a signal that your conscious mind hadn't even caught up to yet. And when you tried to explain that feeling to someone else, they looked at you like you were being paranoid. Dramatic, difficult. Here's the thing though, you probably weren't wrong. You were just operating at a level of perception that most people don't have access to. And the tragedy isn't that you feel too much. The tragedy is that no one ever taught you what to do with it. Carl Jung called this the differentiated perception of the introverted intuitive type. And in his clinical work, he found that people who felt things this deeply weren't broken. They were built differently. Their nervous systems were tuned to a higher frequency. They picked up on information that the average person's mind filtered out before it ever reached conscious awareness. But that gift came with something Jung described as a kind of psychological burden that almost no one talks about. The burden of seeing through masks. The burden of knowing things you were never supposed to know. The burden of feeling other people's emotions so completely that you sometimes couldn't tell where they ended and you began. And crucially, what Jung found is that this is not simply social perception. The introverted intuitive does not just see that someone is being dishonest. They see the archetype behind the behavior. They perceive the deceiver, the shadow, the trickster, the wounded child playing out in real time through another person's actions. This is why their knowing feels so much bigger than ordinary intuition. They are not just reading a person. They are reading a pattern as old as human nature itself. That is both their gift and the source of their heaviest burden. Now, how that archetypal perception actually expresses itself depends on something Jung mapped very precisely. He identified 4 primary psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. When intuition is dominant, as it is in the highly perceptive person, it is almost always supported by an auxiliary function, either thinking or feeling, that colors how that deep perception gets processed. The intuitive, supported by feeling, reads people with emotional precision. They sense motivations, loyalties, and hidden pain almost immediately. The intuitive, supported by thinking, turns their perception into analysis. They build frameworks to explain what they sense before they can trust it. Understanding which combination you carry tells you a great deal about where your perception is sharpest and where your blind spots hide. Jung had a specific term for this last part of the experience. He called it participation mystique. It's borrowed from the anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl, and what it describes is not simply empathy taken too far. Jung was precise about this distinction. It is a state of unconscious psychological merger in which the boundary between self and other dissolves so completely that the individual loses track of where their own experience ends. The I is swallowed by the we. And what makes it so dangerous is that it happens entirely below conscious awareness. You do not choose it. You do not notice it as it unfolds. You simply wake up one day and realize you have been living, in some essential way, someone else's emotional life. This is not a metaphor. Jung documented this pattern across hundreds of clinical cases throughout his career. He found that the people most prone to participation mystique were almost always the same people who reported feeling drained after social interactions, feeling overwhelmed in crowded spaces, and feeling a deep and persistent sense of loneliness, even when surrounded by others who claimed to love them. And here's where it starts to get uncomfortable. Because Jung didn't just study these people. He studied what happened to them when no one around them understood what they were experiencing. What happened to them when the world kept insisting they were too sensitive. What happened when they started to believe it. Consider a composite profile based on closely observed clinical patterns. A woman in her early 30s who came to analysis after years of being told she was emotionally unstable. She had been in and out of therapy. She'd been given different labels. She had a long history of relationships that started with intense connection and ended with her feeling completely invisible. When she arrived, the first thing she said was, "I don't know why I feel everything so strongly. I've been trying to stop for 20 years. What emerged over the course of her sessions aligned almost exactly with what Jung had documented nearly a century earlier. She wasn't feeling too much. She was feeling accurately. The problem was that the people around her were feeling too little, and they had convinced her that her calibration was the one that was off. This dynamic is one of the most consistent findings in research on high-sensitivity personality structures. Elaine Aron, the psychologist who formalized the concept of the highly sensitive person in the 1990s, found in her research that approximately 15 to 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional information at a significantly deeper level than the majority. Her work, particularly her 1996 book, The Highly Sensitive Person, built directly on the Jungian foundation of differentiated perception. And one of her most striking findings was this: highly sensitive people don't just feel more. They process more. They notice more. They make more connections between pieces of information that other people's brains simply discard as noise. But here's where the story gets darker. Because that heightened processing doesn't just make you more empathetic, it makes you more vulnerable to something that Jung described as one of the most painful psychological experiences a person can go through. He called it shadow projection. And if you've spent your life feeling things too deeply, there's a very good chance you've already lived through it. You just didn't have a name for it. Shadow projection is what happens when someone else can't face something inside themselves, so they throw it onto you. Maybe it's their anger. Maybe it's their shame. Maybe it's their fear of being exposed. Whatever it is, they can't hold it. So they point at you and say, "That's your problem. You're too emotional. You're too dramatic. You're too much." Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook. In stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. And because you feel things so deeply, you absorb it. You start to wonder if they're right. You internalize the projection. And slowly, over time, you start carrying a weight that was never yours to begin with. Jung saw this happen constantly in his clinical practice. He wrote about it extensively in Ion, published in 1951, and in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. He found that highly perceptive individuals were disproportionately likely to become the targets of other people's shadow projection. And the reason is almost counterintuitive. It's not because they're weak, it's because they're mirrors. When a deeply perceptive person is in your life, they reflect you back to yourself with a clarity that most people find deeply uncomfortable. And if you don't like what you see in the mirror, the easiest thing to do is blame the mirror. But here is where Jung demands honesty from the perceptive person, because the mirror runs in both directions. Jung was clear. The highly perceptive person is just as capable of projecting their own shadow onto others as anyone else. In fact, the first genuine step of integration is not learning to see through other people's masks. It is learning to ask which parts of what you think you see in others are actually reflections of your own unacknowledged interior. Until that step is taken, even the most accurate perception can be contaminated by the perceiver's own blind spots. Clarity about others always has to begin with honesty about yourself. This is what some researchers in modern psychology have started calling the scapegoat phenomenon in relation to highly sensitive individuals. The pattern works like this. A perceptive person enters a social system, whether that's a family, a workplace, or a relationship. Their natural tendency to feel everything and notice everything begins to create a kind of emotional accountability in the system. People start to feel seen in ways they aren't used to. Old dynamics get disrupted, and because change is threatening, the system pushes back. The most perceptive person in the room becomes the most dangerous person in the room, not because they've done anything wrong, but because their presence makes it harder for everyone else to avoid doing the work. Consider a narrative illustration based on patterns documented across multiple case studies in interpersonal psychology. A man who was consistently described by his co-workers as the one who makes everything dramatic. He was the person who noticed when a colleague was being treated unfairly and said something. He was the person who felt the undercurrent of tension in team meetings and named it. He was the one who, over and over again, identified problems that others preferred to ignore. And over again, he was labeled the problem. He was managed out of 3 different organizations over the course of a decade. Each time, he left feeling like there was something fundamentally wrong with him. It wasn't until much later that he understood what had actually been happening. He hadn't been creating conflict. He'd been the only one honest enough to see it. Jung wrote about this kind of experience in terms of what he called the inferior function. In his typological framework, developed most thoroughly in Psychological Types, published in 1921, Jung argued that every person has a dominant psychological function and an inferior one that sits in the shadow. For the highly perceptive person, the inferior function is often sensation, the ability to stay grounded in the concrete, physical, present tense world. And because that function is underdeveloped, highly perceptive people often struggle with exactly the things that practical people do well. They may struggle to manage money. They may lose track of time. They may forget to eat. And the world reads this as irresponsibility, as chaos, as yet more evidence that this person can't be trusted. But what the world misses is that while the perceptive person is struggling to keep track of their grocery list, they are simultaneously processing layers of emotional and interpersonal data that most people's brains would find overwhelming. They are running a kind of background diagnostic on every relationship in their life. They are pattern matching across decades of experience to identify what's really happening underneath the surface of every conversation. And they are doing this constantly, without effort, without choice, without being able to turn it off. That last part is important, the inability to turn it off. Because one of the things that Jung identified in his study of the introverted intuitive type was a pattern he called psychic inflation under stress. When a highly perceptive person is pushed beyond their limits by chronic emotional overload, something shifts. The signal processing that normally gives them insight starts to become noise. They begin to see patterns everywhere, not just where patterns exist. They become hypervigilant. They start reading threat into neutral situations. They swing between states of profound clarity and states of complete overwhelm. And if the people around them don't understand what's happening, the whole thing gets misread as instability. Research published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience has added scientific grounding to what Jung observed clinically. Studies using neuroimaging found that highly sensitive individuals show significantly greater activation in areas associated with awareness, empathy, and the integration of sensory information, including the insular and the anterior cingulate cortex. These findings, highlighted by researchers Bianca Acevedo and Arthur Aron in a 2014 study, confirmed what Jung suspected. This is a neurological difference. It is not a choice. It is not a performance. It is not a symptom. It is a wiring. And yet here is the part that almost nobody tells you. All of that extraordinary processing power, all of that neurological depth, can be turned against you. Not by other people, by your own mind, by the very psychological structures your psyche builds to protect you from the relentless cost of feeling everything. This is where Jung's work gets genuinely unsettling, because what he found is that the gifted person, left without tools and left without understanding, doesn't just suffer. They build their own prison, and the walls of that prison are made of exactly the thing that makes them extraordinary. And here is where the story pivots to something that Jung found both fascinating and deeply troubling, because he discovered that when highly perceptive individuals are not given the tools to understand their own nature, they don't just suffer quietly. They develop what he called compensatory complexes. They build psychological structures designed to protect them from the pain of constant emotional exposure. And the two most common compensatory structures Jung identified in this population are ones you have almost certainly seen and possibly lived. The first is hyper-rationalism. The highly perceptive person who has been burned enough times by feeling too much starts to intellectualize everything. They build an elaborate mental framework that keeps emotion at arm's length. They become experts in psychological theory, not because they don't feel, but because understanding the architecture of feeling gives them a sense of control over it. They become the person who can explain every emotion in a room without being destroyed by any of them. It looks like strength, and in some ways it is, but underneath it, the feeling is still there, and it is still running everything. The second compensatory structure is what Jung called the persona inflation. The highly sensitive person who has been rejected too many times for being real starts building a version of themselves that is acceptable. They learn to perform wellness. They learn to perform toughness. They learn to say, "I'm fine," with such conviction that even they start to believe it sometimes. They become extraordinary social chameleons. They can read any room and give it exactly what it wants. But the performance comes at a cost, because every time they put on the persona, they move a little further from the thing that makes them extraordinary. The raw, unfiltered perception, the connection, the truth. Consider a case profile drawn from patterns consistent across clinical literature on identity suppression in highly sensitive individuals. A teenager who was so perceptive that she could tell, just from the way her mother set down a coffee cup, whether the day was going to be calm or chaotic. By the time she reached her 20s, she had become a master at managing other people's moods. She knew exactly what to say to diffuse tension, exactly how to make herself smaller when someone else needed to feel bigger, exactly how to disappear into the background when her presence became inconvenient. She was universally described as easy to be around. She was also completely unknown to everyone who loved her, because the real her, the one who felt everything, had been hidden so many times and for so long that she had almost lost the map back. This pattern, what modern researchers sometimes call the camouflage effect in highly sensitive people, has been observed extensively across studies of identity development in this population. Independent work by psychologist Ted Zeff in his research on sensitive men, as well as patterns documented across clinical literature on identity suppression, consistently show that highly perceptive individuals raised in environments that pathologize sensitivity often develop what amounts to a split identity. There is the self that the world sees, and there is the self that only comes out in private or in moments of extreme stress, or in relationships that feel safe enough to hold the full weight of who they actually are. And here is where Jung's clinical work becomes most urgent, because he found that this split cannot hold indefinitely. At some point, something happens that he described as a clarity event. It is different for different people. For some, it is a relationship ending. For some, it is a moment of betrayal so complete that the desire to give everyone the benefit of the doubt is simply no longer possible. For some, it is a health crisis, a loss, a single conversation that finally says what has always been true. But whatever the specific trigger, the structure of the experience is almost always the same. The highly perceptive person, who has spent years or decades making themselves smaller to survive, suddenly sees everything. Not just what's happening right now, but the whole pattern. They see how many times they were right and talked themselves out of it. They see how many times they absorbed someone else's pain and called it their own. They see how many times they looked for the good in someone who was showing them clearly and consistently exactly who they were. I'd call this the beginning of individuation. The process by which a person stops being who the world needed them to be and starts becoming who they actually are. And he was clear about something that most people who talk about individuation don't emphasize enough. It is not a comfortable process. It is not a gradual, gentle unfolding. For the person who has been suppressing their perception for a long time, individuation often feels like an explosion, like a dam breaking, like finally saying the thing you've been swallowing for 20 years and having no idea what happens next. Patterns documented across clinical literature on high-sensitivity adults consistently suggest that individuals who go through what researchers describe as a threshold-crossing event, a moment of sudden, comprehensive pattern recognition, show significantly elevated markers of both psychological distress and psychological growth in the period immediately following. In other words, the clarity event hurts, and it also changes everything, because on the other side of it, for the first time in their lives, the person who feels everything starts to feel it on their own terms. But let's not skip over what the transition actually looks like, because Jung documented it in enough detail that we can describe it with real precision, and it is not pretty. The first thing that happens when a deeply perceptive person stops suppressing their perception is anger, not the reactive surface-level anger that gets labeled as emotional instability. Deep, clean, clarifying anger. The anger that comes from finally allowing yourself to acknowledge what you have actually been experiencing for years. The anger that comes from recognizing the gap between who you were told you were and who you actually are. Jung saw this anger not as a problem to be managed, but as a signal. Evidence that the self was beginning to reassert itself after a long period of suppression. The second thing that happens is grief. And this is the part that catches most people off guard. Because when you finally see the full pattern, you also have to grieve the time, the years spent managing other people's emotions instead of your own. The relationships you stayed in long after you knew, in the part of yourself that feels everything, that they weren't right. The opportunities you didn't take because you were too busy absorbing everyone else's reality to pay attention to your own. The grief is real. It is legitimate, and according to Jung, it is necessary. You cannot complete the transition to conscious sensitivity without it. And then, after the anger and the grief, something else begins. But first, let's talk about what happens if the anger and grief never get to arrive. Jung documented this too. He had a word for it, enantiodromia. It is a principle Jung borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, and it describes what happens when a psychic extreme is pushed too far. Eventually, it flips into its opposite. The person who has suppressed everything suddenly expresses everything. The one who has been managing everyone else's reality stops managing it at all. It is not a breakdown. It is a correction. This eruption of the unconscious is not what the people around the perceptive person expect. They were expecting tears. They were expecting the familiar emotional overwhelm. What they get instead is precision. The highly perceptive person in the grip of enantiodromia does not fall apart. They articulate. They describe exactly what they have seen, exactly what it means, and exactly what they are no longer willing to accept. It can feel, to the people on the receiving end, like a completely different person, but it is not a different person. It is the real person. Finally, and completely, present. Jung saw these ruptures not as failures of psychological health, but as necessary corrections. The psyche has its own intelligence, and when a person lives too far from their own truth for too long, the psyche finds a way to correct course. The correction is not always graceful, but in Jung's framework, it is always meaningful. And for the highly perceptive person, it is almost always the beginning of the real work. Jung described it as the integration of the shadow, the process by which the parts of yourself that you've been hiding, suppressing, and apologizing for start to be reclaimed. The sensitivity stops being a liability and starts being a tool. The perception stops being a wound and starts being a weapon, not in the sense of using it against other people, in the sense of using it to navigate the world with clarity and intention, instead of just absorbing whatever the world throws at you. Here is what that looks like in practice. The person who used to feel everything unconsciously, who used to be pulled into everyone else's emotional field without knowing it was happening, starts to develop what might be called empathic boundaries. Not the walls that keep feeling out, the filters that let feeling in at the right depth and at the right time. They stop absorbing other people's emotions as their own and start witnessing them as information. They stop being the mirror that everyone else uses to see themselves and start being the observer who chooses what to reflect and when. Research in what psychologists now call empathic accuracy, including landmark work by William Ickes at the University of Texas, has found that people with high trait empathy who have undergone structured psychological integration work show markedly higher accuracy in their interpersonal perception and markedly lower rates of emotional exhaustion than those who have not. In other words, the transformation Jung described isn't just philosophically compelling, it is functionally measurable. The people who do this work don't just feel better, they actually function better. They are more accurate, they are clearer, they are more effective in every domain that matters to them. But there is a stage in this process that very few people talk about. And Jung described it with a level of candor that was, for his time, almost shocking. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. And what it involves is coming face to face with the full weight of what you've been feeling and what you've been suppressing all at once. For the highly perceptive person, this can be a disorienting experience because you've spent so much energy keeping the lid on the container that when the lid finally comes off, the volume of what's inside is surprising even to you. Consider a narrative illustration reflecting composite patterns from depth psychology case literature. A man in his late 40s who had built a successful career as a crisis negotiator. He was extraordinary at his job because he could read people with uncanny accuracy. He could sense the shift in someone's breathing that meant they were about to make a decision. He could hear the thing underneath the words that the person themselves didn't know they were saying. He was, by every professional metric, exceptional, and he was, by every personal metric, completely alone. Not because he couldn't connect, but because the depth of connection he was capable of felt like too much for most people to hold. He had one relationship that lasted more than 4 years, and when it ended, he described the experience as finally understanding what every person he'd ever helped through a crisis had felt at their worst. He understood it from the inside. And that understanding, as painful as it was also the beginning of the work that changed everything. For him, what changed? Not his perception. That stayed the same. What changed was his relationship to it. He stopped treating his sensitivity as a professional asset to be contained and a personal liability to be hidden. He started treating it as a single, integrated capacity that operated in every domain of his life. He started making choices from what he could perceive rather than against it. He started trusting the signal, and the relationships he built after that transition were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Not because he found people who were less threatened by his perception, but because he stopped apologizing for it. Jung believed that this was the core transformation available to the highly perceptive person. The move from what he called unconscious sensitivity, being at the mercy of your perception, having it happen to you, being defined by it without choosing to be, to what he called conscious sensitivity. Using your perception as a deliberate act, directing it, calibrating it, choosing what you do with what you feel instead of just being carried along by it. And he was specific about what this required. It required what he called active imagination, the practice of turning toward the inner life with the same quality of attention you naturally extend to the world around you. Most highly perceptive people are extraordinary observers of the external world. They see everything happening around them, but many of them have never directed that same quality of perception inward. They've spent so much time reading other people that they've never fully read themselves. Active imagination, in Jung's framework, is the practice of changing that, of becoming as precise and honest an observer of your own inner world as you are of the outer one. It also required what Jung called the confrontation with the persona, the deliberate dismantling of the performance, the gradual process of asking, who am I when I'm not managing how everyone else feels? What do I actually want? What do I actually believe? What does my perception tell me, not about them, but about me? These questions can feel simple. They are not. For someone who has spent a long time performing wellness and competence and ease, these questions are some of the most confronting they will ever ask. And finally, Jung said it required what he called the integration of the contrasexual. For the highly sensitive person, this often means integrating the qualities that their upbringing or environment told them were inappropriate expressions of their gender. The sensitive man, who was told to toughen up and who locked away his intuition in the process. The perceptive woman, who was told to stop overthinking and who dismissed her own clarity as hysteria. The integration that Jung pointed to was the recovery of those disowned qualities, the reclamation of the full range of perception, not just the parts that the world found acceptable. Here is what the research says about people who complete this integration, and the findings are consistent enough across multiple disciplines that they are worth taking seriously. In studies of emotional intelligence in high sensitivity adults, those who scored highest on what researchers call reflective function, the ability to understand your own and others' mental states, showed the best outcomes across almost every area of life measured. Better relationships, greater professional effectiveness, higher levels of what psychologists call eudaimonic well-being, the kind of well-being that comes from living in alignment with your values rather than just from feeling good. The transformation Jung described isn't just possible, it is, in some ways, the natural endpoint of the highly perceptive person's development, if they allow themselves to get there. But let's talk about what gets in the way, because Jung was honest about the obstacles, and the biggest one isn't external. It's not the people who told you you were too much. It's not the systems that punished you for seeing too clearly. Those are real, and they matter, and the damage they do is legitimate. But the biggest obstacle is internal. It is the part of you that has spent so long identifying as the person who feels too much that it no longer knows what to do with the possibility that the feeling was never the problem. Jung described this in terms of what he called unconscious identification with the wound. It's the way that suffering, when it goes on long enough, starts to feel like identity. The person who has been told they are too sensitive for long enough may begin to organize their entire sense of self around that sensitivity, not as a gift, as a problem that defines them. And when the possibility of transformation arrives, when someone offers a different story, the unconscious mind can resist it with surprising ferocity. Because if the sensitivity isn't the problem, then what was all that suffering for? This is the moment that Jung considered the most critical and the most dangerous in the individuation process. The moment when the person sees the possibility of a different relationship to their own nature and has to choose whether to take it. He was not sentimental about this moment. He did not promise that the choice was easy or that the path forward was clear. He said, in his characteristic directness, that becoming who you actually are is one of the hardest things a human being can do, not because the process is complicated, but because it requires you to let go of the story you've been telling about yourself, even when that story has been painful, because at least you know how it ends. And here is what he said to people who were standing at that moment. He said, "The sensitivity is not going away. You did not ask for it, and you cannot give it back. The only question is whether you will use it unconsciously, being used by it, being defined by it, being drained by it, or whether you will use it consciously as the extraordinary tool that it actually is." The choice is not between feeling and not feeling. The choice is between being at the mercy of your perception and being the master of it. That is the warning in the title of this video. Not that sensitivity is dangerous in itself, but that sensitivity without understanding is dangerous. That a highly perceptive person who has never been given the tools to understand what they are and why they experience the world the way they do is at genuine risk. At risk of being exploited by people who sense their empathy and use it as leverage. At risk of developing the compensatory patterns that eventually become their own kind of prison. At risk of spending a lifetime being right about everyone else and wrong about themselves. But the warning comes with its other half. Because Jung also found and documented and staked much of his theoretical legacy on the claim that the highly perceptive person who does the work, who goes through the confrontation and the grief and the anger and the integration, becomes something genuinely rare. Not rare in the sense of being a special snowflake. Rare in the sense of being a person with an extraordinary capacity for accurate perception, deep connection, and clear truth-telling, who has also developed the psychological infrastructure to hold all of that without being destroyed by it. Someone who can feel everything and still choose how to respond. Someone who can see through the masks and still choose compassion. Someone who can absorb the room and still know exactly where they stand. Jung called this the individuation of the introverted intuitive, and he said it was one of the most valuable psychological developments a human being could undergo. Not just for the individual, but for the people around them. Because a fully integrated, highly perceptive person is not just surviving in the world. They are contributing to it in a way that compensates for exactly what the world most lacks. The willingness to feel, the capacity to see clearly, the courage to say the true thing, even when the true thing is inconvenient. You are not built to suffer. You are not built to manage everyone else's emotions at the expense of your own. You are not built to be the mirror that everyone else uses to avoid looking at themselves. You were built to perceive with extraordinary precision and depth, and then to do something with what you perceive. And the path from where you are to where you could be is the one that Jung mapped out more than 100 years ago. It is not easy, it is not quick, but it is real, and it is yours if you choose it. Every single thing that has ever made you feel like you were too much was pointing at the exact same thing. The perception, the depth, the signal. They were telling you to turn down the thing that makes you extraordinary because it made them uncomfortable. And here's the final thing that Jung would want you to hear. You don't have to turn it down. You just have to learn to turn it toward yourself with the same honesty and precision you've always turned toward everyone else. That is the work. That is the transformation. And it starts right now with the simple recognition that what you feel has always been information. You just needed someone to tell you how to use it. When you stop seeing the sensitivity as the problem and start seeing it as the signal, everything that has ever confused you about your own life starts to make a different kind of sense. The exhaustion makes sense. The loneliness makes sense. The way you can walk into a room full of people and still feel like no one actually sees you makes sense. It's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you've been playing the wrong game. And now you know there's another option. Your perception is not a burden. It is a responsibility. Stop apologizing for it and start understanding it. We've covered a lot of ground here today. From the neuroscience of high sensitivity to Jung's framework of differentiated perception. From the shadow projection that targets the most perceptive people in any room to the individuation process that transforms suffering into strength. If any part of this landed for you, if any moment made you think, that's exactly what I've been trying to explain my whole life, then leave a comment right now. Tell us, I choose conscious transformation. Or just, I see everything. Because you do, and it's time you owned it. If this video helped you understand yourself even a little bit better, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like it, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.